Hello and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 82, bringing on an author and talking with them about one, occasionally more, of their books in detail. I'm Charlie Place, and today I am joined by Paula Cocozza, whose debut, How to Be Human, was shortlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize. We'll be talking today about her latest novel, Speak to Me. Our as-yet-to-be-named narrator, named by the end of the book, is feeling lonely and neglected in her relationship and life in general, and she very much misses the previous house her family lived in, which they moved away from to please her husband. Her husband, Kurt, is too involved with someone else, but Kurt isn't having an affair, and the couple aren't polyamorous. No, Kurt is in fact far too involved with his mobile phone. Hello, Paula.
Hello.
I'm going to ask the obvious question that everybody gets asked all the time. Can you tell us about the initial inspiration for the book?
Yeah. So probably 10 years ago, I would say, I just started to really notice that wherever I went, people were on phones or devices of one kind or another. So at that point, I had two children, ages 5 and 2. I myself would be in the playground and I'd be busy checking emails, and I would notice other parents pushing pushchairs in this sort of strange one wrist on the pushchair way so that they could also scroll at the same time. I'd go to cafes and everybody would have their phone with them. I'd go to bars, restaurants. Phones seemed inescapable, and as time went on, they were inescapable in my own living room as well. I would just go to say something, and whoever I wanted to talk to, their eyes were downcast because they were looking at something on their little tiny screen. I felt a sense of alienation, I think, in those moments, not just in my home, but just entering a cafe and, maybe you go to sit down next to another stranger, and whereas normally you might share a glance or a nod or a smile, just people are preoccupied. So I started to think about, why was I feeling so angry about it? And also, if I'd known what I knew about communication now, when I was a younger person, would my relationships have been different? Would I have, been attracted to different people? I just started to kind of hypothesize about what life might have been, either if we didn't have tech now or if we had had it at a time when I lived without it. And I think I channeled that sense of alienation, really. That became a very fruitful place for me. And I didn't write this book in order. So my first novel, I kind of had a sense of this is going to happen, and then this and this and this. And I had a little list, actually typed out on my very old Nokia then, that I was kind of following in sequence. Whereas with this one, I just let my strong feelings take me. And so I would write pages in this vein, and then after a couple of years I had plenty of words, but I just really wasn't sure what order they ought to go in. So I think probably most of the composition time was in reorganizing and just layering over what I already had.
I have a question that is probably going to get into the writing in a minute, but on this then, in 10 years, things haven't changed since you first had the idea. People are still very into their phones.
Yeah, well, things have changed. So the book is set in 2011. So that's actually 12 years ago now, isn't it? And I had to do a lot of research around where phones were at that point in time. The house moving that you mentioned, that was 2007. So the smartphone in the story there is actually the very first iPhone. And at that point, I believe we did really regard that device as something quite wondrous and magical. The sleekness, the beauty of it. And there is some kind of sense of that in the book. But then I guess also we didn't use phones in quite the same way. I think most of our lives now are rooted through our phones, from, checking how many steps you've done or who you need, what appointment you've got, or when your period's due, whatever it is. It seems everything is just kind of funneled through your phone. So I think the scale of it has changed. It's intensified, but also it's become more casual. We're more habituated. So we have to work much harder now to give our attention elsewhere, I think.
Absolutely. I'm going to have to ask a potentially uncomfortable question to you.
Here goes.
What's your relationship with your phone like?
Well, so sometimes my children or my partner tell me to put my phone down. I think I'm not bad. I've got a bit of a thing for the New York Times Sudoku, and I do find myself getting really absorbed. I am not one of those endless scrollers. I don't really do that. I don't have that many apps. I'm not massive on social media. I do bits. I'm going to say moderate use. I am interested though in the kind of social mores around it. Like, is there anywhere where it's not okay to use a phone now? I became very curious about that. I wondered whether when people get married, say, do they have their phones in their pockets? Are there any moments where they're not nearby? Because there's loads of forums where people complain about being interrupted during sex by their partner's phone and their partner stopping to take the call or answer a text. I think it's commonplace to use it in the bathroom. I mean, who can honestly say they have never looked at their phone in the bathroom? We're both silent. So I'm interested also in that. What's still taboo?
I didn't expect myself to be so involved in the interview, but yes, there we go. But you say that. I wish restaurants where you're sat, be it around a table with friends or you're face to face with a date, boyfriend, girlfriend, etc. And that's still, people have their phones out and stuff.
Yeah. I think it's sad. It saddens me to see it, and I don't like it if I'm at a table with somebody and they're on their phone. If they need to stop and do something urgent or important or that's really got a call on their time, fine. But if they're just kind of casually checking their notifications, I feel like that could wait. But I think that's the thing about phones. They make you feel they can't wait, or you won't wait, actually. We won't wait. We feel that urgency. And I'm not sure how much control over that we have.
That's a very good point. Yeah, no, but I will say I'm going to have your where to find Paula online in the show notes. And you will see, listeners, that there is a Twitter account. And that is it.
There is.
So that is an effective proof. We've discussed the generality and we've gone to you researching and things. Were there any particular honing in real life stories of phones damaging relationships that inspired you?
Well, I used to talk to a lot of parents at the school gates. I would just bring up the subject and see where it went. And quite often people would have a story. One person told me about how it was her daughter's phone, she'd thrown out the window and smashed. She was really cross. There was that story about Kirsty Allsop a few years back who smashed one of her children's iPads because she was just infuriated by how much time they were spending on it. So she did it in. And lots of people I spoke to had what might seem like quite small, precise moments of grievance. So the one that came up a lot was first thing in the morning, my partner, and it's not always men, but in the cases I'm thinking of, they were women I was talking to. First thing in the morning, my partner looks at their phone. Before they say anything or acknowledge me in any way, they pick up the phone. And that one came up a lot. And it was for people who, they weren't checking something urgent. It was just habitual, just to look and see what have I missed overnight. What's happened in my world. And I guess that's the thing. The world on the phone starts to feel like that is your world. And where you are in your kind of direct relationships, I think they do suffer.
Totally. I'm going to go back to what you said about writing, because I find it very interesting given what I've noted down effectively about what I liked about how you wrote the book. Can you tell us about how you wrote it? And you say you wrote it in, how was it you said it? A bit here, a bit there, and then you put it together.
Yeah, actually, I dedicated it to all those who write in the scraps of time that the rest of life leaves, because that's definitely something the narrator relates to, but it's also pretty true of how I wrote it. I work 3 days a week in my job at The Guardian. In theory, I have 2 days a week to write fiction, but I also have kind of a strong care situation at home, so I have to do a lot of care work that often takes away the fiction writing days. So it really is a battle to try and find time. And what I found with this book was I thought I knew how to write a novel after the first one. I thought, make a little list and plan, write to those plot points, see where I am, allow plenty of scope for the story to surprise me, because I like to write with a certain amount of openness. and possibility. But actually, this story did not come out like that at all. It took me by surprise. I thought, oh, I know how to do this now after the first one. But I really found that each book has its own way of coming out. And each time you learn to write that book, but not necessarily the next one. And so this one came out in short bursts. And I was not as productive in terms of a word count, for instance, as I had been with the first one. I had no period where I just crashed through 10,000 words in a couple of days. It was just very much small outcomes, which I would then work over and over and over. I feel like it's more worked over and it's more thoughtful and considered, but also it's been pieced together. It came out in pieces, and then probably 80% of the job of writing was working out which order to have the pieces in. Yeah, so it was kind of interesting for me. And as I say, not what I had expected.
That's interesting. So, I mean, I thought it was interesting how you have a bit from the present day, effectively, our narrator's talking about the present day, and then she'll think of something else from a few years ago, and then she'll go back to the present day, and then she'll think of something from 10 years ago, and things like that. I suppose I want to ask, why did you choose to write it in that manner, or indeed put it back together in that manner, however you did it?
Yeah, I always thought that I had three. I think initially I thought of them as boxes, but by the end I could open them out a bit, them as slightly looser shapes, but three writing boxes or writing lines, which in my head I just thought A, B, C, and one was the present. And that almost wasn't really there to start with. And then every now and then it would kind of butt in and I'd think, that's something I need to listen to. And so it kind of grew. And then there's the very recent past. And then there are these little bits from further back in time, which kind of ambush the narrator every now and then, I think. You can tell where she's headed when these sort of nostalgia moments, I suppose, get more potent and frequent. I guess there's a point where those three lines collide, or those three boxes intersect, and she has incredible momentum at that point in the present of the story to go off and do something quite dynamic in relation to her past.
Well, I think it's right to say that one of those is about her current housing situation.
Yeah.
Her missing her former house, which she definitely preferred, and what happens with that. I suppose before we get to that bit exactly, why did you decide to tell it in these phases of estate building?
Actually, that I decided quite late. I wanted a really clear-cut structure. And I think that to me felt like a necessary counterpoint, because I thought of the sort of method of composition as sort of loose leaves in a way, because that's how I had all these various little bits. It was like having loads of pieces of paper, although in reality, most of it was on the computer at that point anyway. I did switch to paper at a certain point. So I then decided that it would be a really strong structure, would be a very interesting thing to develop, because it would create some definition around all the loose leaves. I had done a lot of research on housing estates anyway, and new build estates and how the development goes, and they seem to be often described in phases. And I thought this could work well as a structure. So I started thinking of almost like a 3-act play: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. I think the narrator references phase 4 at some point, but that's kind of a red herring because she's not there then. I was able then to have a sense of, okay, so this bit I've got, is that phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3? And it actually gave me a brilliant handle on where I was going. And it was a great shaping tool, I think. And it made me be very disciplined about what happened when, about the choices I made, to really hold myself to account on those. And I could have fun with making little things develop in different places. Now I'm going to try and think of an example. But for instance, there's a little thing about pennies. I think she remembers, the narrator, that her children used to like picking up pennies when they were very small. And so in one phase, she might remember that. In another phase, she might point out a penny and they're just not interested. And in the third phase, one of them might give her a penny. And so I could have all these little tiny plot lines that maybe were just a sentence or two, and just dropped in each of the three phases. So I did quite a lot of work on that to try and get a sense of the story moving through those phases in all its parts.
I like how, because you've got it in the phases, you've got a visual metaphor in that you've got that when she moves in, she can see the sun going down, etc. She can see the moon. And then as the houses are being built up around her, she can't see them because there's buildings in the way, which obviously matches how she's starting to feel more and more depressed about her situation. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, thinking about where the light was in the story, about how the view was changing, how the building noise might be going further and further away, all of those sort of sensory details. I really enjoyed kind of thinking about how to keep those present in each of the phases and how would those be changing, to kind of try and inhabit that space as fully as I could. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you about the reliability of your narrator. I'm sure we'll get to talking about who she is in a minute and her name. I did find at times that I wasn't sure, even though obviously we've got this situation and we feel sorry for her, I wasn't always sure if I was meant to believe her or not in some aspects. Is this something that came into writing her?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I never believe everything any narrator tells me. I like that, enjoy sort of exploring those grey areas where you're not quite sure how much to take. And I think she does give herself away a bit. She's very censorious about phone use in her own home. But in, say, the second phase, there are little hints that her own use is perhaps on the increase. So she'll sort of say something like she's passed a church and it's number 2 of 10 things to do in the area. Or, she's kind of giving herself away. Or she'll leave a cafe and say, no, I don't want to share my review. Well, she counts distances in steps and things. So I think, there's no intention to deceive, really, but perhaps just also no obligation to be totally honest.
I'm going to admit something that's possibly going to make me sound really silly, actually, but I was really looking into, while I was reading it, how reliable she was. And there did come a point where the sheer lack of communication between her and Kurt did actually make me wonder if this was a sort of almost ghost situation, if she wasn't actually there.
So Kurt is silent in it, apart from the 3 words that he kind of exhales in a state of dysregulation in the first page. He is then silent for the whole book. And I always knew I wanted him to be silent because I wanted to really take to an extreme the impact on communication and so on. But I think there are points where the narrator says things that make you wonder, is he really silent? Or in her narration, has she kind of muted him? How much is it one way or another? Because I think there's a point pretty late on, it's quite a touching scene where he is comforting her and she sees ink on his face that has come from her pen, or it's on his tongue. And she says, which is funny because I've tried really hard not to put words in his mouth. And I think there is that sense of it's not quite clear how much didn't he say and how much has she not reported what he said. So that's definitely an ambivalence that I wanted to keep in there.
Well, do you think it's important to keep the ambivalence to the end, or should we come to a conclusion at the end as to how truthful this idea of Kurt is?
Well, I think it is truthful in that it's her truthfulness, and as much as any of us can claim to have one, that is hers, and I think she's delivered it as honestly as she can. So I think I'm very much on her side. I've got a real soft spot for her.
No, I think that's a very good point. That is a very good point. We've got the side of the story there, definitely, and it's how she feels. You have a reference, and this is where I think we're going to get to her name. You have a reference to Susan Cain's Quiet. I think it's a few sentences in the paragraph or something. But this is now the 3rd Susan. So if we say the narrator's name, we find out later is Susan. She's got a co-worker called Susan. I wondered at one point if actually there was only one person called Susan and there was a lot of story extra here. But was it important to cite Susan Cain's book, and did it inform the book otherwise?
Well, I think there are quite a few Susans dotted around. She does have a thing about her name since you've outed her. She says that she always wished she was called Suze or Susanna or Suzanne or just something a bit livelier. So she has a bit of a problem with her name. But as the story goes on, she does start to collect Susans of note. Susan Cain, and because she's a librarian, my narrator, she would have been aware of that book. It's just between its announcement and its publication when the story's set. So since my narrator, I think, would have described herself as introverted, that's a book that definitely would be on her radar, and she found interesting enough to mention. She also mentions Suze Rotolo's memoir. That's the former Muse girlfriend of Bob Dylan. And she mentions how the voice of Siri was first created by a woman called Susan. And if you look up in Wikipedia famous Susans, the first one that used to come up, I don't know since the Queen died whether this is still the case, but it used to be the Queen's corgi, Susan. So I think it's partly having some fun with notable Susans, and also definitely those themes of introversion, of reserve, of giving voice when you feel maybe you don't have a voice, because finding her voice, that's definitely a strong pathway in the book. You know, she is collecting her words and she is finding a place to put them, and ultimately finding someone to listen to her. Although the book's called Speak to Me, I think that's where it kind of travels to.
You've made me think of another Susan, actually, that doesn't get a
Good.
word in at the end. Susan from Narnia.
Well, there you go, exactly. Susan from yeah, so there's a line in it where she says, in literature, they're always sensible children or spited wives. Because Susan in Hanif Qureshi's Intimacy is a spited wife. And yeah, I was definitely thinking of Narnia as well.
Very interesting. Completely different topic now, though. Can you talk about the role of, I think it's the Victorian terrace, I think it's a Victorian terrace house or a Victorian house, the role of this for our narrator, who we know is Susan. It's quite nice to out her in a way, because there's so many narrators that we don't get to talk about the names. It's nice that we get a name. It's lovely. Can you talk about this old house, what role it plays, etc.? I mean, I saw it as she goes into the old house when she shouldn't, to find her happiness again, to find out who she is. Is this, yeah?
I think that's definitely the right track. The funny thing is, actually, telling you earlier where the story came from and mobile phones and seeing them everywhere, I guess that was that part of the story. But another part of the story was that I had a case of old letters, many of which were love letters, because that's how we did love then. And my case went missing when I moved house, much like Susan's. And I'd only moved to the next road along. So I used to walk past my old house quite a bit and kind of look at it and think, I wonder if my case might be in that loft. And what would it be like? I quite like just sort of spinning out stories in my daily life anyway. So I would enjoy walking past this house and just spinning a little story for myself. Well, what if a character felt this, and what would they do? What if they went in? How would it go? So she goes back and she does have a kind of an encounter, but every time she tries to find something from her past, it feels elusive. She just can't quite catch up with it in the way that she needs to. And in the end, it's not really about the case. Again, inside the case, there's something else that she wants, and inside that is something else. It's this sort of endless questing and yearning, I suppose, for something. So I guess that's what goes on in that house. She does find something, but what she finds just tells her she needs to keep looking and look harder, look further afield. And it's a turning point in the story.
Well, one of the layers of things that she has to find is Anthony, her former lover. And I was interested to see how this developed and where it went. It struck me that in many ways, Anthony isn't so different to Kurt, or at least her experience of her relationship, because Anthony himself always seemed like he wanted something more. And whereas Susan was telling us that Anthony hadn't effectively made his move on her, we can see that actually he probably did, and it was the other way around, that it wasn't so great. Can you just talk about Anthony, her relationship with him, etc.?
Yeah, so Anthony was her first love. They used to write to each other after they went to university. He was not someone who really believed in monogamy, so he had lots of other girlfriends. She never quite knew what she had, I think. And she kind of makes the comment that maybe ours was a paper love. He's almost like a paper man to her, like one of those little figures you might make as a child. He was so good on paper. His letters were so utterly winning and charming and loving, or so she thought. But then in person, he didn't quite match up. And I think she has to then think, as you say, about whether she had matched up. What had she been like in person? And so the book does move towards this very special in-person encounter. That's all kind of comes to a head in the final third of the book. And I wrote that phase of the book differently because Susan basically kind of gets on the road at that point in time. She heads off with paper and pen to find this person. And I decided that at that point in the story, I too would put away my laptop and I would switch to paper and pen. So I drafted the final third like that, my old ink pen and a notebook. And it was really interesting to me to see how those different approaches to composition had an impact on what I was writing. I had assumed I would come up with the same words on paper as I would on the screen. And of course, I'll never know how I might have written it on the screen, but I know that my hand moved very fast over the page, and it was as if more happened and more happened quickly. There was definitely a sense of immediacy about it. Just the fact that I could open up this notebook anywhere and write a bit, and that was it. And I wrote every day, and I think it was only sort of 2-3 weeks, and I'd written the whole thing. Yeah, so Anthony is very much the kind of physical presence in the story, I think. And maybe he's different from Kurt in that I think he's more of a multi-sensory experience somehow. She can remember the smell of the phone box when she used to call him. She can hang on to the tweed of his jacket or just one thread and feel something in that elusive tuftiness of his jacket that tells her who he is. So I think in a funny way, he is more present to her.
I'd agree. I think in what you've said about her being able to like touch his coat and also talking, but yeah, the communication is different. Whether or not it's overall better, I mean, it's just different. But you saying about how you wrote it, was your sort of immediacy and your getting it down on paper so quickly, what do you think made that change for you?
I think it was because I had this ink pen in my hand. I had a nice notebook. I felt the ink came thickly and slickly. The whole thing felt freer and more fluid somehow. So my thoughts and the movement of my hand felt very connected. And it was like something quite visceral, really. There's a scene actually, because I tried to get myself to put some of it in the book, this feeling. And she said that she's got one hand on her heart, one on her pen, and that while the heart pumps, the ink flows. And I think it felt like that to me, that it was almost, I felt very physiologically present in the book somehow at that point in time. And because the first part is so much about technology, that felt like a really good place to be. I don't want to make it sound like I think there's some divide between, new tech and old, and one's good and one's bad. The book hopefully shows that life's more complicated than that. But it does have a different flavor to it, that final third. And I think it's partly because I wrote it in this way.
That's interesting. And I mean, certainly it's the right part of the book for you to have done so as well, almost, even if a reader doesn't necessarily know that you wrote it in that way and you switched to pen and paper, it's definitely the perfect point of it for it to have happened. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel the imprint is in the book there. It doesn't matter whether people know it or not. I think it's there, and you feel these things in your bones, and that's good enough.
So, other than Susan Cain's Quiet, but far more a particular book, I'm going to call it a book, it's not, it's a play, Twelfth Night. Can you tell us about your use of Twelfth Night, and Malvolio in particular, I suppose we should say?
Yeah, I had a slightly, I think, kind of a comic impulse to have Malvolio in it. Although I've always struggled with that play, Twelfth Night. I knew I needed a play with a letter in it. And I picked Twelfth Night because it's got such a complex figure in Malvolio, but also with quite a lot of absurdity. You know, the yellow crisscross stockings and so on, and his facial expressions. And people like to argue over that play. Is it a tragedy? It's kind of a comedy, but it's a bit dark. He has a rough time. So, yeah, that's a play within the story. I wanted to put Anthony on the stage. I wanted us to see him there and for my narrator to see him there. And it needed to be in the right kind of role that was partly a bit absurd. It's kind of hard to fall in love with Malvolio, but that's what's going on. So I was having a bit of fun. Sometimes I think when you're writing, you know, if something's making you smile, then it can be quite a good instinct to go with.
Do you feel more comfortable with the play and feel like you know it better now?
Yeah, I mean, I saw it a couple of times while I was writing. So yeah, I think I do. But also it was just quite fun to kind of have a little nose around what people were saying about it when it first came out and to filter all of that through the very partial lens of the narrator, who's obviously just really desiring that character at that point in time.
I think it's interesting that Susan leaves Anthony thinking that maybe they'll get together again and they might talk, but she hasn't given him her phone number. They haven't talked about that. And then she realises also maybe, well, I don't think she actually says it, but you kind of realise that she's thinking she doesn't really need to as such.
Yeah. Yep, I think that's a pretty good assessment of where she is by the end. I mean, there are little hints that she might, you know, she knows where the play is going next and after that and after that. I think it's going to Hereford, and she has a little moment where she kind of finds out a bit about Hereford maybe on Google or something. But she makes kind of a wish for him at the end where she wishes, may he find his film, whatever it is, may he find his thing. And I think for herself at that point, she is really understanding that that's his business from now on, and it's really not hers. And there is a leave taking, I think, that goes on after she has left him, where she takes her leave in a very personal way for her.
With Kurt, we know that she doesn't necessarily say everything that she should. And we know that he probably doesn't say what he should. But if we put it on Susan, simply because she's our narrator, if she had said more, do you think there would have been a chance of their relationship going a different way, being better?
Well, I mean, I guess all relationships might go differently if we said different things. No doubt that's true for them. But I think she realizes a certain point where she wants it to go. And then the words she needs for that aren't necessarily words in a conversation that we need to hear, because the book is really the slice of her life. It's what she chooses to tell. And I was thinking a lot, you know, when we're on our phones, people see this window into our lives, but there's a lot that obviously goes on off screen that nobody knows about. And the book works a bit like that too. There's a lot that might be happening off the page and we don't know. We just see the little bits that she thinks she must share. So we don't know in the book how much they say to each other, really. And that was definitely one of the challenges of writing. But also, it can only really move in that one direction. I think I knew quite early on where it was going, although I didn't know the order of events that would kind of get the characters there. I think I had a sense. I knew the mood music that I was working to. So I don't wish for them that they'd talked more. I'm just happy that she did what she needed to do.
Fair enough. I think we get an idea of what's happened to the briefcase before she finds it, or before she's given it back. He was affected by her relationship with Anthony and the thinking she was doing on it then, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the novel, I guess, is about distraction in some measure and attention, as we discussed earlier. And, you know, he has his phone and she is outraged by that. But we can see as readers that she has her own distractions, and that's this case of old letters. So there's a kind of equality, I suppose, about their distractions, or a kind of odd balance about them. And she is pretty absorbed in her own way. And she's pretty absorbed by her activity of sharing her story as well. And there are little betrayals of that in the text. I think at one point he leaves the room and, or she thinks, oh, has he said something? Oh, he's left. Was he talking to me? Because she's busy telling us everything that's going on. She's missed him talking to her, and she turns around just to catch him sticking a finger up at her. So I think there is definitely a playfulness about types of distraction, and it doesn't really matter whether your distractions are on paper or in person or on the phone. The choice to give attention to people and to attend to your relationships and to have meaningful communication, that doesn't really come down to a device of one kind or another, does it? It comes down to different life choices and just what we make important to us.
Very true. Yeah, I think the part where he sticks his finger up at her, it's sudden. It's almost a surprise. I think you've been seeing that things may not be quite exactly she's telling you, but that was an absolute, from you effectively, I suppose, there you go, think more into this. But both shocking and almost kind of expected, I think, which is an interesting combination. I feel we should talk about Susan's sons. We get the idea the one she calls her eldest is maybe a little bit more aloof, but the younger one seems to want more communication and time with her. And it does feel, and maybe this is the same case with the eldest and we just don't see enough of it, you do feel that maybe she's not there all the time for them in the way that they maybe want her to be. Can you talk more about their relationship?
Yeah, the sons I think are interesting. They're not named in the story, and she often thinks of them as a pair because they're twins. So she tries to be sort of scrupulous in specifying whether the elder or the younger has done something. But I think when they move into that new build house on that estate, the boys are 12 and, they're children and they love and need her. But they're at that age where I think within a few short years, really, I'm not saying they don't love and need, they do, but they also need to not need to push away, to kind of brandish their independence. And definitely that's something that goes on. So in the same way we talked earlier about how the sunset is there in the first phase and then it's harder to spot and it's gone altogether, I think right at the end there is a sunrise. The boys, they change over those phases as well. They go from being kind of Harry Potter reading kids sprawling around on the floor with toys everywhere to, they're kind of in the shopping mall and, one will acknowledge her and one won't kind of thing. So as the phases go on, they go through a period of, I suppose, estrangement. But I think by the end, there is more connection. I remember writing a really nice hug, a three-way hug in the last section. And of course, they're growing. And just like that, the estate is shooting up. Well, so are the boys. And, that's part of Susan's discomfort, I think, is seeing the world around her growing and the world in her own home growing and just feeling like she's stuck. So I guess the boys are a counterpoint to that in a way.
I liked their presence and their role in the story. I thought it was lovely. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
So, I mean, is there an importance, I expect there is, of Susan being a librarian loving books?
Oh, yes. Oh, I'm glad you asked about that. Yeah, definitely. I think it is a book for people who love books, really. It's a celebration of all of that. Books were so important to me growing up. I grew up not in a family of readers. We didn't really have books at home very much. And the library, it was like a halfway house for me between my home and school. And I'd stop off often coming home and get out my 3 books. In those days, we checked them out with a little laser pen and it was all wood panelled and quiet and probably a little dusty. And it felt like such a homely place to me. And I was quite a quiet, reserved child. And books, I think, gave me a place to be and to feel connected. And so as I read more, I think I felt a lot less lonely. And I wanted to make sure that some of that was there because I think books really are an important part of my identity, of growing up, my coming of age, now my coming of middle age. And also, a few years ago, I became a trustee for a charity, the Reading Agency, which kind of believes in the power of books to transform life opportunities and to connect people. And I was so pleased to do that because those themes were very close to my own heart and close to my own lived experience. And if you come from a kind of perhaps a working class background or a deprived background in some way, then books, I think, can be a great way to open a door to a future that you might not necessarily imagine. So in the book, they kind of perform that role. And I did have experience of that in my own life, I think. And yeah, it's something I really care about. So it felt good to honour libraries and the work that they do. And I mentioned earlier that it's set in 2011, and that was a time of massive change in libraries. You know, when there was, at a time of austerity, loads of cuts, people losing their jobs, automatic checkout points coming in and becoming more widespread, all of those things going on. The more I looked into it, and I interviewed a few librarians for the book who had worked at that time, it seemed to me that there was this kind of depreciation of libraries going on. And I just felt that again, it fitted with the story. I wouldn't have done it had it not. Well, it felt like part of the story, is the truth. So I definitely wanted to tell that bit.
Can I ask when you first started reading?
Yeah, my mum taught me to read before I started school, actually. So I used to read Little Janet and John books when I was about 4, and then I used to always ask for a book for my birthday. I remember Gobelino, for instance, all kinds of books that I wanted. But it was really at secondary school when I met, you know, as so many of us no doubt have, an inspirational English teacher who gave me a reading list and sent me off to the library, that I really started reading then at great pace. I got through so many books, and some were kind of, you know, Thomas Hardy and Jane Austen and Catcher in the Rye and Steinbeck. And I just remember reading and reading and reading, and every book feeling like a great discovery. It's such a great age, isn't it? Between kind of 13 and 16 to be really getting into books.
I can't say I did so much reading at that time, but that was because I didn't quite get the classics. So at that time, but yeah, no. Got back into fiction afterwards and kind of got back into the modern day stuff, and now love classics. So yeah.
I think we discover different things at different times. So I feel like I missed out on loads of children's classics. And then as a parent myself, I've read loads of books like The Borrowers or The Railway Children, you know, all the classics of children's literature that passed me by growing up because we didn't necessarily have that culture of reading at home. I've definitely rediscovered. And I think that's great. We all have our own reading journeys and we discover different things at different times. And that's the fun of it.
Yeah, it definitely gives you the age, and also the experience you have at that particular time gives you a different experience of it anyway, which is always fascinating to think about. So I'm going to have to ask another probably expected question. What's next? What are you writing?
What's next? Well, yeah, I am working on a couple of ideas at the moment, but I'm still figuring out which one I'm going to do first. So I'm interested in the idea of an older narrator and older characters, older female characters. I think this is quite a fun territory, actually, because I think we get very used to sort of pinning certain voices on certain characters of certain ages. And I sort of want to play with the idea of youthfulness in our later years. And partly I'm thinking about this a lot because I write a series for The Guardian called A New Start After 60. So I talk to a lot of people who describe themselves as in their final act, one kind or another. And the kind of energy that goes into living those later years is really interesting to me. And I would quite like to write a youngish book with an older character. So that's one thing. The other thing I'm interested in is writing about a neurodiverse family. I haven't quite figured out, I'm still sort of scratching around and doodling. I like to go through this kind of stage where I just let myself play, really, have a bit of fun, no pressure, just explore. So I'm at that stage, and then I'm hoping that come maybe September, I will knuckle down and commit, because to write a novel, you really need that 100% commitment. You need to believe absolutely in the reality of the world you're building. I don't think you really think of it as building it. It's just there and you're learning it almost. So I'm not at that point yet. I'm figuring out which one I'm going to get to that with first. Or it could be something else, I suppose.
It'd be interesting to see where you go with that. I suppose with the second one, you've got to see where you want to take it. Well, you have brought up your writing of the garden. You have a lot of those New Life After 60 articles. Can you tell us how you go about writing them, etc.?
They're wonderful, actually. Most often people write in, and so a lot of those people are readers, or they're just things that I come across in life and get in touch with someone. But the idea is that people have a chance to talk about a new start that they've taken after 60. And, I had a woman the other week who gave a TED talk in her 90s, and she'd just finally accepted and understood that she was divorced at the age of 93. Somebody else who's, I don't know, driven road trains, someone else who's shaved their head in their 60s for the first time, a woman who shaved her head. And all these stories have in common a readiness to kind of just change tack a little, quite dramatically, at a time when people would once have been thought of as slowing down or retiring, what a word that is now, but that sense of withdrawing from life. And this column really celebrates people empowering themselves to go out and explore and live and do whatever they wish. And it's been a great privilege. I've met so many interesting people, and each interview I do, I feel slightly adjusted myself. They're very inspiring.
Yeah, if you wanted to do a new career after 60 or something like that, you definitely got loads of ideas, certainly.
Yeah. Well, I'm 51 now, so I think this is all quite handy. I'm getting all the ideas, and when it's finally my turn, I'll know how to do it, whatever it is.
Yeah, no, don't get me wrong there. You're writing, that's great, but if you happen to, it'd be good. Paula, it has been lovely having you today. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been lovely.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Do join me next time. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 82, was recorded on the 6th of July and published on the 11th of September 2023. Music and production by Charlie Place.